what do I want my life to look like as a youth pastor?
Right.
Like, I was like thinking through, like, I want to equip students to be able to lead. I don't want it to just be like, I get up and speak and then get off the stage and then kids go home and remember absolutely nothing.
Welcome to the Disciple Making Youth Ministry Podcast, where we talk about the calling of youth pastors to equip students for the work of making disciples, moving teens from church attenders to disciple makers. Here are your hosts, Joel Friend and Jeremy Collins.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Disciple Making Youth Ministry Podcast. We are so glad to have you here. How are you doing today, Jeremy?
I'm good. It's sunny outside. It's cold, but it's sunny.
It is so cold.
I'll take sunny and cold.
Outside. Well, I'm glad that Sophia is here with us today, Sophia Roll, and she is on staff with us at New Community Church, and she's our Associate Director of Student Ministries. And I'm excited that Sophia wore her coat out in the cold today because it took you up until last November to own a coat, like officially own a coat as an adult?
Yes. So it's kind of my brand. No, I'm just kidding.
Right.
No, I just didn't have like the money for a coat. No, I'm just kidding again. But literally,
Youth ministry pays a lot.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
They pay me very well. But I literally I was like, I'm fine without a coat. And then we were revving up for Laurelville, and I was like, I should probably get a coat. So.
Yeah. Well, the first one we did. The first one was in November. Mm-hmm. And she had to borrow a coat from somebody who happened to be at the church at the time we were leaving. It was our children's ministry director. She was like, "Do you need a coat?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then the next, well, you got your coat from Goodwill?
Yeah, $12.
$12. Hey, that's a solid deal. I think, does anybody shop at Goodwill in the sense of like that's where their primary clothes come from, or do people do it because of like, I don't know. Do you know what I'm saying?
No. I shop at Goodwill because it is the cheapest option, and I am a cheapskate.
Okay.
But I know some people do it for like the thrifting experience, but I'm not that person. I shop there purely because it is
I go
cheap.
the week before Laurelville to get clothes that I don't want
get
back
muddy.
again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then some people don't shop there because they think the Goodwill's the devil.
Oh.
I don't know. You ever meet those people? Mm-hmm. Got those people too. So anyway, if you're still with us, we're having a great conversation. We're excited because, two things that we wanted to talk about today. One is the fact that Sophia has just completed her first 2 years in full-time youth ministry, and we wanted to bring her on to kind of have a couple different perspectives in terms of like, how was that experience? What did you learn about discipling kids? And, how was that a part of your own discipleship process? But we also thought it'd be really great to break the gender barrier here today.
Finally.
On Disciple Making Youth Ministry Podcast, because Sophia is the first woman that we will have had on this episode. I'm proud of us breaking through that barrier.
It only took us to, this is 19 episodes in?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, and so we've checked the box, and so no women will be on for the remainder of the existence of this podcast. So Sophia, let's start off by talking about you. I know that's your favorite thing.
I love to
talk about you. So tell us a little bit, tell the four people listening a little bit about yourself here today.
Okay, so a little bit about me. I grew up in the North Hills area of Pittsburgh, went to church most of my life, and met the Lord when I was probably like 11 at a kids camp. And, been following ever since. I decided I wanted to go into youth. Well, God called me.
Right.
Into youth ministry when I was probably a sophomore in high school is when I realized. And it was definitely a call that God put on my life, because before that I was like, I might want to be an engineer, I might want to be a doctor, I might want to
you want to make money, and then you were like, I don't want to make money.
It was literally...
So that will go with the youth ministry route.
Yeah, no, it was so funny because money was definitely something that I stressed out about,
Sure.
like as a kid for some reason. And I just remember like growing up, I was like, I want a job that will make money.
Right.
and here I am shopping at Goodwill. so
Interesting.
Yeah, so for me, like, youth ministry, I, started off volunteering and then eventually started to do internships when I was in college at 2 different churches and did some volunteering experience with a local ministry that, like a parachurch ministry.
What's it called?
Young Life. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of it.
If anybody's heard of that.
Yeah.
No, me?
It's pretty well known, I would say.
It's pretty
it's
off the grid,
Yeah. They're in there. It's in its roots right now. We'll see where it blooms from here. Awesome. And that was your whole college career, which, by the way, I'd like to point out was only 3 years. So she finished you finished your whole college degree in 3 years, right?
Yeah. So I don't know how it happened, but it sounds way more impressive than it actually is.
Well, it was the first thing I said to her in her first interview with us. I said, I took 4 years to finish college, but on here it says you're doing it in 3. Tell me more about that.
What if I was just really bad at math?
Oh, right. What if it was a typo on your resume?
That would have been funny.
I didn't even think about that for a second, but it was cool.
And she's been keeping up the lie all this way.
This whole time. You're like, I want him to keep believing that.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. So you did that. Did you do Young Life all 3 years?
Yeah. I did Young Life all 3 years. So that first year in college, the first semester, you're supposed to do like leadership training. It's called first year. And so I did that for the first probably 6 months. And then after that, you get placed on a team. And I got placed on a team out in the Highlands High School area. So that's Natrona Heights. Go Golden Rams.
There you go.
It took me a second to remember the high school. But it was a formative experience for me to work in a parachurch ministry because I'd only like really done volunteering in churches before then. So
sometimes when you go through the college experience and you get to that moment where you have to like make a decision for what your career is going to be. So you were pretty sold and set on like, I want to find a job at a church in a youth ministry. Was that kind of where you were at?
Yes. I mean, I didn't really ever think about doing anything like what the Young Life people do because I feel like, church was really where I felt called to as far as youth ministry goes.
Sure.
I think there was like a brief period of time where I was like, maybe I would want to do something like that. But I think probably my second year in college, I was like, no, I think a church is where I'm called to. So.
Now, go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, well, and I was going to ask because, one, I love that you corrected yourself and caught yourself and said that I chose versus called, because I think talking about calling is really important, especially for those that might be listening who are considering youth ministry or questioning if it was the right decision at this point now, and falling back on that calling. So what was that like to come to a conclusion, come to a thought that this is where God is leading me into ministry? How did that go?
Ooh, so I was, like I said, 10th grade, I started to volunteer at the church I grew up at, and I was a volunteer leader for the middle school girls, and I remember I like really loved it, and we went off to some summer camp type thing in the summer, and at the end they were like, and if anybody feels called into ministry, and I remember like being like, maybe that's me. Yeah. Because up until that point, I'd honestly only thought that like men really got called into ministry, even though I had a female youth pastor. I think in my brain I was like, it's just some people do that. Right. But I remember them saying that, and I was like, wait a minute, I think that's me, because I realized when I started to volunteer that it was something that I was just good at, like hanging out with kids. I was like, that came very naturally to me, and I'd grown up in the church, so I knew a lot of the like Christianese language, but I think for me, going to that summer camp and then being like, and if you, they did that sort of like call out, like, if you feel this way, stand up. And they were like, if you feel called into ministry, like, feel free to stand up. And I just found myself standing up. And it was one of those moments where I was like, I don't know if this is like what I want to do, but I feel like this is what God wants me to do. And then for the rest of my high school experience, it was a little bit of like, well, do I just feel like I should go into youth ministry? Is that actually where God's calling me? Because I feel like I tried to fight against it because I wanted to be in a stable, like financially stable career. Right. And so I kind of kept trying to find ways out of it, but I knew that that's where God wanted me to go.
Well, I'm grateful for that because of you coming to our church, and you've done such a great job these last 2 years. One of the things it just like dawned on me as you were talking here. Sometimes what you see is young people who are trying to get a youth ministry position. I mean, you were 20 years old when you were trying to come in to get the youth ministry position. And so to most people, you go, wow, that person is incredibly green in the sense of their youth and all those sorts of things. And so that, I think for most people, that ends up being kind of not a red flag, but you caution, you kind of proceed with caution.
Most people are looking for experience, like 2 years of
experience.
Here's
here's where Sophia kind of started to take off from the rest of the pack, and she had a ton of experience. So she put herself in a position where she was learning and growing and being able to come. Probably she didn't probably realize it at the time, but like when I looked at her resume, one of her things was like, you said you were like, I know I'm young.
Yeah.
All those. I was like, yeah, but I've realized that experience is experience, right? So the important aspect of what you've been able to do these last couple of years is actually put yourself in a position to learn and grow. So if you're someone who's younger in trying to pursue youth ministry, like one of the most important things you can do is start to volunteer somewhere, so that when the time comes for you to be, handing someone a resume, that they can see those things on there. Because I think sometimes what happens, especially, if you're not going to like Geneva College, kind of requires you to do that, which is also a plus for you, is like nobody told you because of a credit grade that you had to get a certain amount of hours in order to meet your practicum so you could pass this course. You did it because you love Jesus and you love students and you wanted to pour your time into that. So if you're a young person on here and you're trying to get a job in youth ministry, do not downplay the amount of experience that you can get, so that someday someone looking at your resume will be like, wow, I know that they may be on the younger side, but my goodness, do they have a lot of years under their belt in this experience?
Well, and it's two things then. You're getting that experience, but you're also, one, getting a mentored opportunity where you're learning from someone, because in my role, I stepped into youth ministry and I was kind of mentored a little bit, but I didn't know what I was doing. Said before we started, I wouldn't hire me today if 2006 Jeremy came and applied for a job, because I didn't know what I was doing. And so getting that experience of being in a church, that's huge. And I think then it allows you also to have someone who can write you a good resume of what your life in ministry will look like. Yeah. Because that's not hard it's hard to do, I should say, if you don't have experience.
Yeah. I think with experience in youth ministry, I'm really thankful for all the years I had volunteering and, not in a paid position, because and I don't mean this to sound the way that it's going to sound, I was able to make a lot of mistakes. I was able to screw up a lot. And for somebody to call me out on it, like someone I really look up to, Jenna, who you guys both know and love, she was my youth pastor. She called me out tons of times. And I feel like being able to volunteer really allowed me that space to grow without that expectation of and granted, I'm in full-time ministry now and there's still no expectation for me to be perfect, but there's definitely more of there's a higher
standard. It depends
standard.
on your boss.
Yeah.
It depends on how great your boss is. So, yes, but that's a good, go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah. So just that idea that being in a volunteer position allowed me to grow and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, as opposed to just jumping in and having no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah, so that may transition us into our kind of our first part of this conversation, is what are some of the highlights of what you've learned in your first 2 years of full-time ministry? I know there's some things that you learned in your part-time season as well, and I'm sure it's a little different than your full-time season. What are some of the highlights from your first 2 full-time years?
I think some of the highlights from my first 2 years in youth ministry is just how healthy a staff can be. Not that any of the churches or parachurches that I worked for were super unhealthy, but it was just, I feel like one of my highlights is just being able to watch a staff love and grow together, and to just be able to support one another well. Granted, it hasn't always been easy, especially with COVID, but it's been really that has been very uplifting for me. Another highlight of mine is just the way that we are able to equip students to disciple one another and to lead is something that I always admire in a church, and something that I always, when I decided, or when I thought through, what do I want my ministry to look like? What do I want my life to look like as a youth pastor?
Right.
I was thinking through, I want to equip students to be able to lead. I don't want it to just be I get up and speak and then get off the stage and then kids go home and remember absolutely nothing.
Right.
And so, but it's been really cool to watch the students that we have just lead and serve one another in just such incredible ways. And so that's some of my highlights. But
yeah, it's good. I'd love you to talk a little bit about, I totally forgot about this. So you had an uphill climb in terms of your settling into your job, because about 40 days into your job, a global pandemic began. So we hired you February 1st of 2020, and then the world shut down on March 13th of 2020. So what was that experience like for you?
It was terrifying. I remember just when it started to, like, everyone was like, okay, we're shutting down because of COVID.
Yeah.
Like, it'll be like 2 weeks. Remember that?
Right.
And it's not 2 weeks.
When people question, like, wait, we're not going to be in person for 6 weeks, we're like, yeah, we think we'll be good by then. And 6 weeks came, we're like, oh gosh.
It's been 2 years. But like, that was terrifying to me because everything I knew about student ministries revolved around that, like, in-person relational aspect.
Yes.
And having that taken away and it just becoming like a little bit more consumer based of like we talk about how online church sometimes can just feel like they're just consuming. And I feel like for me, I had to reevaluate everything I was doing. And we talked about this. I think it was like one of the first couple weeks of COVID. We were like, we have to think through, what is this going to look like? So it was definitely terrifying, but
Yeah, it was one of those, like, we have to choose what we really want to value in our ministry because we have this unique time to do it. So, and I thought we worked well together through that. I just remember that first night of doing the online. I was like, I hate every second of this.
Yeah.
It was just so hard.
I wonder if anyone listening we'd love to hear from you if you've been through some of this as well. Maybe you started a new church, because I'm sure that there's someone who started at a new place by themselves. Even at least you had the grace and the be able to come on staff with Joel, so you weren't by yourself. I can't imagine what it would be like to start in youth ministry, either your first position or a new position, and then a pandemic hit. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us at disciplemakingym@gmail.com.
Have we really heard from anybody, Jeremy?
No, we've never heard from anyone.
I'll start emailing you guys.
We're in
or you
episode
can-
9 of season 2.
Hey, who knows? Maybe someone wants to talk. Also, you can check out our website.
You have a website?
We do have a website.
We do have a website. I
It's
still owe you money for that, by the way.
dmympodcast.com.
I'll remember that.
dmympodcast.com.
It's good. It's a nice website.
It is. It's updated, has the new stuff up there now. But in all seriousness, these are the conversations we'd love to be able to have with people, because I think there are some stories and things that can be learned, like what you're saying is stepping into a pandemic and learning how to do relationship alongside everything else is tough. What were maybe some of the other things other than pandemic related that you kind of went, whoa, I wasn't ready for this. I thought I knew ministry coming in.
That's a good question.
Because I think you have the experience coming into a position, but at the same time, it's different once you're the one in that seat.
Yeah.
So what are some things that maybe brought you back, or you fumbled the ball on? Or
There's so many things.
I'm sure. Hey,
Where
it
do I
happens.
begin?
I didn't ask you, Joel.
No, you didn't ask me.
No, I think with starting youth ministry and all that stuff, I think I was really well prepared by my boss and mentor and youth pastor, Jenna, all of the above.
Right.
She prepared me well for all of the administrative stuff, and I knew how to hang out with students, and that all to me was like, okay, got this under my belt. Something I really needed to work on was speaking, because for me, like, I remember, the church I grew up at, the church that I primarily spoke at in their youth ministry, I felt comfortable there, so it felt natural to me. I thought I was just naturally good at speaking, and I think to an extent I am, but it made me realize, like, I need to actually work on my talks a little bit more than I thought I did, because I'd get up there and I'd feel so nervous, and I had to, like, work through that within myself. Another aspect that I, like, definitely kind of took me by surprise was just how many meetings with parents I have to do. I don't know why. In my brain, I was like, yeah, students. I love hanging out with students.
Right.
And I was like, oh yeah, the parents. Yes, I have to talk to moms. And and I remember the first mom I met with, her name is Becky. She's the most wonderful woman on the planet.
Yeah.
She was so loving and kind and awesome, and really just so complimentary towards our youth ministry.
Yeah.
And that was my first experience, like, really, like, meeting with and establishing a relationship with a parent. And then the pandemic hit, so that was really good. But just, there were a couple of things that I think, even though I knew how to email people, I knew how to use CCB and all
Right.
that stuff, like, I feel like there were just little things here and there, like meeting with parents, or really prepping for a talk that my brain just completely was like, oh yeah, no, I have to put in effort for these parts.
Yeah, so when you are in a volunteer role, you kind of have a niche thing that you end up doing, and most of the time it's that relational piece. Versus then when you're in a role like the other, you take on all of these other roles. Not only you're admin, but you're also the communicator. You're also you're the marketing person. You also have to lead worship if you have like one of the mistakes you made was telling me that you play guitar and sing, right? So then all of a sudden you're recruited into that. Lee, who is the newest guy on staff, he has communicated he does neither of those things, and so we don't have an expectation as you're nodding your head here viciously. But
and neither can I. I've been up in front.
Right. So
well.
it's one of those okay, so I think sometimes. Not to say you did this, but I think sometimes what younger people coming in the ministry do is they have in their mind what youth ministry is like XYZ, but it's actually like A through Z, right? You show up and you go, whoa, like I didn't realize there was all of this and in the responsibility of like leading kids to camp.
Ooh, yes. Yeah. Well, I'd led a couple camp trips before, but never as the actual like the point person.
The point person.
It's exhausting, isn't it?
Oh, man. Oh, man.
I can't wait until I'm retired and I'm an old man and I'm just a volunteer in someone's youth group. I'm going to love going to camp then.
Yes. Oh, my gosh. Yes. So let me tell you how you're doing it wrong
no,
there, Sonny.
I will not.
Yeah. So,
well, and that's a great question. What advice would you maybe have for someone who is in those first 2 years? Something that you maybe wish you had told yourself sooner? Something
That's a great question.
Yeah, because I think that as we're thinking about advice, again, the types of people that are listening to this are looking for people, how to disciple people better, but also someone who's probably clicked on this has said, yeah, I'm in my first 2 years. This could connect with me.
Right.
What's maybe some advice to give to someone in that spot?
I would say my best advice would probably to come in it with humility, because I think and be able to be corrected, because I think those first 2 years sometimes you can come in even with like I volunteered before then. I came in and I was like, I kind of know what I'm doing.
Right, yeah.
And like, you don't. And so I feel like those first 2 years, you really have to be able to accept that correction, accept that guidance from people who are older than you. So seeking out like mentors or a pastor, or like just someone to help you along was really important for me. Like even just having people you can bounce ideas off of, because otherwise you're just like, you're in an echo chamber of like, yeah, of course I'm doing everything perfectly. Like you need someone to tell you like, hey, no, what you did right here, that was wrong and you could do this instead. So just that being able to be corrected and making sure that you have mentors or a pastor in place to guide you alongside that. So
that's awesome. I think
I think that's, and if you don't have that, find a network.
Yes.
Of youth pastors. Yes. And because we've talked about that before, but this idea of finding colleagues as well. It's not that we want to steal each other's ideas and compete for kids but being alongside other youth pastors who are doing things. I can't tell you how many times Joel and I have sat across from each other, had conversations, and I'm thinking in the back of my head, oh, I'm going to do that. Right? Yeah. And that's just not necessarily you sitting here giving me advice, but when you start having conversations of what others are doing in ministry, and if you're doing this alone, don't do it alone.
But also that you're also open to trying new things in youth ministry too.
Yes, definitely. Because I was definitely like, I had been mostly a part of outreach ministries, which outreach, like it works for some people. For us, like we're more discipleship minded. Not that we don't reach out to kids, but like, you know what I mean. And I feel like for me coming into a ministry that was less about games and skits and upfront stuff and more about, relational one-on-one ministry with kids, definitely was an adjustment for me. But I will say about like having a connection of youth pastors, it's so funny because I feel like when you're not in youth ministry like fully, like when I was just a volunteer, I always thought that youth pastors were like in competition with one another, but our like youth pastor network is so like supportive, like PKF. I think we can plug them, right?
Yeah, they were on the podcast.
Yeah. I remember Jack and Roger.
There you go.
But like I feel like that to me, like being in those meetings, it's so supportive and so loving, and you get to bounce ideas off of one another,
Right.
which is so, like, I have a friend, Allison, who no longer works at a church, but she used to, and we used to meet up, and we'd just be like, hey, what are you doing? And can
Right.
I steal that idea? But
Yes.
like, just
And it
that.
goes the other way too. You need that person to say, "Hey, it's not working. Help." Because we've all had those nights in youth ministry where we've worked hard for something and it's fallen flat, and my wife doesn't want to talk about that, and I don't want to sit there and vent there.
Right,
And,
yes,
And but to be able to have those conversations, especially early in youth ministry. And as I think back on my own time in early youth ministry, it was getting connected to the PK and at that time now PKF, and just having those conversations around coffee of how do you do confirmation class? How do you get parents to fill out forms for a trip? How do you, like, some of the things
Right.
that, like, I had never thought of. I had never done youth ministry before I got hired to do youth ministry. My youth pastor was my dad. My Sunday school teacher was my mom. Like, it's I didn't have a context of what youth ministry even could be. So getting that's a plug. Don't do this alone. And that's in many ways. And as you said, Joel, before, you came here, you didn't know there was a network. You're like, I'm going to start my
Yes.
own. Like, you can start your own network if
Yeah.
there isn't one that exists.
Yeah, that was a funny story. But I wanted to piggyback off something you were saying earlier about discipling kids. So, like, you've had these 2 years in full-time ministry to go through the process of helping kids to be discipled. Could you share a little bit about, like, that experience? You know, what have you learned about discipling students overall?
Oh, what have I learned? I feel like these past 2 years, it's been so cool because, like, we actually, this past year, so not this year, but the year before, my, like, first, like, full,
Right,
like,
yes.
school year
Yep.
in full-time youth ministry, we had this group of, like, 12th grade girls who were just so solid.
Yep.
All of our other kids are solid too, but like, those kids, I think of that, and that was like the perfect way to start off
Right.
Full-time youth ministry, because like discipling them was like easy.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as discipling goes, like, I feel like one of the things I've definitely learned about discipling is just this aspect of, like, you got to put in the hours. Even when you don't feel like it. We were talking about how sometimes people will be like, well, I'm done at 5:00. And that's just not how youth ministry works. Like, you're kind of, I don't want to be like, you're on the clock 24/7, but it's a little bit of like, you have to put in the time and the effort and get to know these kids and have a personal relationship with them before you can ever hope to, like, disciple them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I feel like, for me, one of the things that I've definitely been convicted of, like, especially when I first started out, was this idea of, like, I can't lead kids where I have not gone. So I can't be like, you guys need to read your Bible every day, and then be like, but I'm not doing it.
Right.
Like, that's not, I cannot disciple kids if I am not being discipled. I cannot lead kids if I'm not being led. So, like, just this idea of being able to put in the effort for my own discipleship in order to disciple others.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's good stuff. I think when we come in, it takes us a little, maybe that lonely feeling we have, and then I think there was parts of me when I was younger when I also felt like, well, I could do this by myself, and then very quickly finding out you can't. So I think that can help with the process to get to that place where you go, okay, like, I need more people, and that accountability structure too, I think, is a part of that. I think we talked about that with Paul, the importance of accountability. So yeah, that just kind of rang true for me in my first couple years.
And
go ahead.
I didn't have that either, and it wasn't until the last 6 or 7 years between Lee being on staff with us and getting to work alongside him, and now you get to. I'm jealous. And
You should be.
And I miss that guy, but I'm glad we're neighbors and we're gonna be hanging out more. And then bringing on Kaylin, former student, to be on staff and to be able to work alongside someone who's on staff versus relying on volunteers who you love and you care for, but like you said, they don't live, sleep, and breathe it, and I'm not asking them to do that. But having that person to talk with, to vision with, to have tell you, no, that's a bad idea, and you trust them enough to go, yeah, you're probably right. Man, that is so essential for what we do in our context. And I know that's not going to fit for everyone listening to have that. But again, and it might be harping on this a little bit too much, find then a volunteer who can be that with you. That is more than just a colleague or something who's in the trenches with you at your church, whether that be your senior pastor. We just talked about senior leadership on our last podcast episode, or whether that be a network, we've already said that, or that be one of your trusted volunteers. You have to find that.
Don't do this by yourself.
Yeah, it takes a village is the mentality of youth ministry and discipleship. I can't do it all on my own. I can meet with kids every hour of every single day, and it still wouldn't be enough. You need your volunteers, you need your senior leadership to pour into those kids.
Then why is it that when we look at so often churches' view of youth ministry, when you look at job descriptions and what churches are looking for in a youth pastor is this person who can do it by themselves?
The do it all kind of individual. Yeah, I think what's funny is even if I look at your job description, which I wrote, I mean, it has to be overwhelming for somebody who's maybe not seen it before. And obviously you have to say yes to those sorts of things, and then there's all these things that kind of happen along the way, so you want to communicate. So it feels like you're asking for a person who can do it all. I totally agree with that. It just depends on how you're structured too. I think we have a very unique structure, and it just got even more unique, but I think even better. So I think in most churches they operate in the capacity of you have a high school pastor, middle school pastor, and then there's other people who you have you have the director of student ministries, and then you have maybe an associate sort of person. I don't know if that's that often that's done that way. And I think what we have is what we had before we hired you was this director person who kind of did everything, and then we hired an associate person. And the thing that happened with our position is the fact that we had a female person there, and then that person left, and then we took on another female person. So what we created for our structure was that there was a guy for the guys and a girl for the girls. And where we're at right now is, I think, in the best possible place with that, because me moving out of my role into the overseeing role, now we have one person who's designated for female ministry, and then we have one person that's designated for male ministry, and it's clear. We have a friend of ours who they just recently hired a middle school person, and they happen to be a woman who's the middle school person in title. But then I said, but does she go to all the high school things too? And he goes, yeah. I said, that's not fair, right? That's not fair to her. Not to be too, this is just sometimes how churches work, is but they're paying her for doing the middle school job, but she's doing high school too.
And that's how you create burnout, is when when you set these expectations so high, but give them this title of you're just the middle school director, but you also have to be at every single high school thing.
Yes.
And that's not the only example of that, but just this idea of expecting so much out of one person is how you get people who leave youth ministry after 2 years.
Well, and what you also get is someone who can't focus on discipleship. If you're doing that, then you're going to make it about all these other things instead of actually the goal of making disciples. And I think when I look back on my first 2 years, I was caught up in so much of what I thought youth ministry was that I wasn't actually doing ministry. I was an event planner for a bunch of middle school and high school kids, and I did a pretty good job of that. But that's not what youth ministry should be. That's not what we see outlined in Scripture of what it means to make a disciple. And so as you're considering this 2 years, and as I'm reflecting back on mine, because it kind of puts us there, figure out you in youth ministry, what you're going to focus on. And if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have already agreed you want to start focusing on disciple making. Make sure that that's reflected in what you actually do, what your job description looks like, what your time looks like. We've talked about that in other podcast episodes. But I think that's really important, because it can be easy overwhelmed if you're starting in a new place or your first few years in ministry. sometimes it's a whirlwind. You don't get a chance to even think about that stuff.
Yeah, and what's funny too is we're on this, like, if you were to look at a book on like healthy sizes for churches and how many staff people you need, we're like right on the cusp of. Yeah. So like sustainable youth ministry talks about, like, if you have like 50 to 70, you need one staff person for that. When you get beyond that, then you need 2 staff people. Yeah. We actually are in the realm where some people would say we technically only need 1 staff person. Could you imagine being hired as a new person your first 2 years and doing not only what you're doing right now, but everything that I'm doing too?
Oh, I would cry every day.
Yeah. So
the pain that I just watched wash over your face.
So if you're a senior leader, like, one way to avoid burnout for your people is, don't expect them to do everything, especially if you have the budget and the personnel, or go through that process of hiring another person to be able to offload that. I think part of the reason why you've been able to stay afloat for so long is because you're not doing so much more on top of that. And why I think moving forward, you and Lee will be able to do very well is because you guys know what your areas of responsibility are, and you know what you share together. Yeah. But you can dream together, and it's not all on one person to be able to do that. You share the load.
Yes, and I think that is so important, because I feel like people, and by people I mean church leaders, can sometimes get this idea of like the burnt out youth minister who leaves after 2 years, like, oh, they just weren't in it, their heart wasn't in it, they weren't cut out for youth ministry. But no, most of the time it's just that they're not well equipped, and that they don't have the resources and they don't have the time to pour into 70 plus students every single week. Like, if it was just me, I would be burnt out. But luckily we have a great system in place, and we have a great structure in place so that, I can feel supported, Lee can feel supported, you can feel supported. Like, I think that is so important to prevent that burnout in youth ministry that happens in those first 2 to 3 years a lot of the time.
So for the person that could be there in that burnout season right now, we've given some pointers and things we do to get out of that. But I'd also just highly encourage you to talk to your senior leaders about what discipleship should look like for your church, because if your church is not fully bought into what youth ministry can be, then of course you're not going to have that support. You're not going to have that ability to add a staff person or things like that. But if you're someone who's looking at the church and saying, how do we build up the Big C church more? It's by making disciples who make disciples, and statistics show that more people come to faith or make a decision about faith prior to turning 18 than any other time. And so youth ministry is vital to the building of the Big C church. And so if churches are serious about kingdom work coming to fruition in this next generation, you got to make it a priority in your budget. And if you feel that your church isn't a church that's doing that, have some conversations about why that can be. And that might then be able to get you the help that you need if you're feeling really stuck where you are.
Yeah. I think talking to your senior leadership is such a great point that I think people don't think about, because it's like, I don't know, for our church, maybe I'm just lucky because I love our senior leadership. Like, our pastors are great. You're great, Joel, because you're now a senior leader.
He was waiting for it.
Yes, he did.
Thank you. I needed that validation.
I know that for some people, that feels scary, because it's like, some people are a part of mega churches. Like, you don't really know your senior pastor all that well. Sure. Like, I know Mark super well.
Yeah.
Super well. I know him well.
Well enough.
And I just feel like if you want to see change and you want your youth ministry to be more discipleship oriented, talk to your senior leadership.
Well, and isn't that one of the big, I haven't read the book in a while, but Doug Field's book, 2 Years in Youth Ministry, talking about getting on page with senior leadership is a big part of that.
Yeah, I mentioned that on here before, and I think that's such a crucial book. And it was funny, as you and I, that was the very first book you and I went through together, was your first 2 years in youth ministry. So, the other thing I was just thinking through too is I think sometimes it's also the culture of your church that can determine that too. Imagine you set up a structure where it's very office business oriented, and then you trying to you have to schedule a meeting with your senior that feels just so scary. Not organic. It doesn't feel like it's a culture. It feels like it's a culture of hierarchy rather than of leadership where we're all in this together. I can go into Mark's office anytime I want. Now, in my role, I felt like I can do that. I should be able to do that now. But you should feel like you should be able to do that. And then, anybody new would feel I can totally go talk to Mark about anything, because he's opened. his personality is kind of like a very social guy who really loves hanging out with people, who cares about people. And so when you have that in your culture and people seeing you as a senior leader in that way, it actually shapes your office and it shapes how things are. So you feel like you got access to your senior leader versus I think sometimes you just get this chain of command that you have to go to in order to express certain things, which I think there's a time for that. But if you really need pastored by your senior pastor, like go to your senior pastor. I mean, that's what he's there for too. I know that's been true of me. So one last question as we wrap up is, I think one of the things that we can talk about on this podcast a lot is the giving end of discipleship towards students and families. What have you learned in your first 2 years of your own discipleship? What has God taught you in these first 2 years of your own discipleship process?
I think I have learned how important community is, which it's funny, our church is New Community
Church, Wexford, PA.
Yeah, we exist to make disciples
who live and love like Jesus, who know him, grow up in him, and go out for
him.
Boom!
Wow. Anyways.
Knuckles.
That's impressive. Good.
Thank you.
I'm glad one of you didn't get it wrong. You'd have to be fired.
That's
right.
right.
So
Mark
bad.
would be so proud
Yeah,
that
he
we
would.
said that in sync without notes.
Yeah. But anyways, like that idea of community is just so important. And I feel like I've grown so much in these first 2 years of student ministries, like full time. Not just, in my role as a associate director of student ministries, but also just as a follower of Jesus. Because I feel like our church sets us up well in that sort of discipleship process where, like, I have a young adult small group that I go to every Wednesday night. And I'm actually hanging out with some of those ladies tonight, probably. If we don't cancel, we might cancel. But anyways. Anyways. But, like, just this idea of making sure that you have people around you who love you and support you and can help you to grow and call you out when necessary. Like, I think that is so important. So these first 2 years, what I've learned about discipleship is just that importance of community. Because I remember coming on staff, like I was the designated young person.
Mm-hmm.
And
I still am not as young, but yeah, sometimes you get that role. Yeah.
And there weren't, I mean, I love our church, but it wasn't like, we didn't have that many young people coming to our church, like, as far as, like,
I think I was the second youngest person until you showed up.
Yeah. And so, like, for me, community was something that I was just longing for, especially in the midst of COVID, of, like, I felt crushed by that sort of, like, doing this on my own. I didn't realize how much I needed community because I'm introverted, but I'm not that introverted, I guess.
Right.
Because I really, like, that being in community and being able to meet with people every single week and being able to grow and love people and serve people, like, that has helped to grow me as a disciple of Jesus. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think, you did something I think could be unique for some people. There's a phrase that I've heard someone say, it's like the moment you start working for the church is the moment you stop going to one. And I think that you being committed to what is happening within the body of our church community, I think was really good. And even you as a young person too, I think when you came into our church, at that time, I think we were on the sort of middle age end. Mm-hmm. But since you've been here over these last 2 years, the young adult community has grown, and I think part of that is also your commitment to it. So I think and you and I've talked about this, what you're looking for out of that community is not that you can lead it, but that you can be a part of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's such an important aspect of this, because sometimes when we work for a church, we feel like we're always on. And what I hope for you as we move into the future is that you can continue to feel as though that you can just show up to it and be at it and be led by it.
Yes, yeah. You actually, that always on phrase, you actually said that in a staff meeting once. I remember you were teary-eyed as you said it.
It was tough.
Where you're like, I just feel like I'm always on Sunday mornings. And I related to that. And I think I cried too. Anyways, it was
Everybody
an emotional
cried. That's how you know
meeting.
It's working.
Yeah. But but just this idea of as people who work in ministry, as people who work for a church, you need someone to pour into you. Because otherwise you're just spinning your wheels in the dirt. Like, I so need that community. I so need to be poured into, and I can't just lead all the time, or else I'm not going to be led. And like I said before, I can't lead if I'm not being led. So anyways.
Well, that's awesome. This was really good.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Jeremy, you want to wrap us up, even though I'm the one already talking?
Yeah, I would be glad to. Well, Sophia, thanks for coming on. It really was great to get to know you more. I'm excited for what you guys have going on. I hope and pray that things continue in the direction that they're going. All you listening, if you're still here, we love you too, and we're praying for you. We hope and pray that this has been a blessing to you, whether you're in your first 2 years of youth ministry, whether you're a parent who's just listening or whatever. We just appreciate you. Thank you for taking the time. We'll catch you on the next one. Have a good one. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Disciple Making Youth Ministry Podcast. We sure do hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe wherever it is you consume your podcast. We hope you have been encouraged by what you have heard and you're ready to jump into the hard work of disciple making. Catch you on the next one.